It is all on you.
Okay, so the next slide. So I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Joan McGrath, Executive Director of Planned Lifetime Assistance Network of Massachusetts and Rhode Island, or PLAN. And I'm joined by my colleague, Kathy Vitello. She's the Director of Operations and, more importantly, a licensed social worker. What we were hoping that you would get from today's presentation would be what a special needs trust is, the benefits of a professional trustee, and how to fund a special needs trust. So a little bit about PLAN. PLAN is a 501c3 nonprofit organization. We are the oldest and largest in Massachusetts. We were founded by parents of children with disabilities in the late 1960s. They were looking for ways to advocate for their children. We were incorporated in 1971. We have approximately 750 beneficiaries and 60 million in assets under management. And most importantly, we have licensed social workers on staff that help beneficiaries, they guide beneficiaries in how to use their trust. Next one. I guess at this point, I'll introduce Tom Alessi and Craig Richardson from the ARIES Foundation.
Tremendous. And we just want to say, and I'm going to speak on behalf of Craig and myself, we just want to say thanks for having us in. My name is Tom Alessi. I've been in financial services for over 21 years. I'm an investment advisor, which means I act in a fiduciary capacity whenever I'm dealing with giving advice or guidance to any of my clients. Craig, you want to introduce yourself real quick?
Sure. So I'm Craig Richardson. I've been in the financial services industry for a little over 16 years now. And I specialize in working with families and small businesses to help them develop comprehensive financial plans and have a better relationship with their money.
And as Joan mentioned, so Craig and I really work with trying to help support families with an individual who's differently abled or has a disability through our special needs resource network. But Craig and I also last year started a nonprofit foundation. It's the ARIES Foundation for Financial Education. And through that nonprofit, we do a lot of the work in the special needs community, trying to connect with and help support a lot of the organizations and professionals like Plan of Mass in Rhode Island. So again, Joan and Kathy, thanks for having us here.
Great to be together. So I'm going to start with a little bit about the types of trusts that PLAN administers. We administer D4C and D4a trusts. The difference between a D4C and a D4a is the D4C is pooled, meaning that the beneficiaries join a trust with no minimums. They don't have to have a minimum to join the D4C. Their funds are pooled for investment purposes only. And each beneficiary has their own sub-account. So all transactions are accounted for each of their own funds. And people over 65 can join a D4C. A D4a trust is a standalone trust. Both of the D4C and the D4a are funds of the beneficiary for the first party, where they are for their sole benefit of that person. No one else can be, the funds can't be used for any other person. For a special needs trust in general, that is to protect the benefits of the person, the disabled person. A third-party trust would be, the funds would be for someone else other than the beneficiary. So it would be a family member, a grandparent, a friend. Someone has put money in trust for the beneficiary. And the difference between a first party and a third party is the first party is a payback trust and the third party is not. So with proper planning, you can set up a third-party trust for your loved one where you can protect their benefits, preserve their assets, and help them to live a full life. You can move forward. So I'm going to pose questions, a series of questions, but if you have other questions that you would like, please put them in the chat box and we'll try and address those at the end. But I'm going to present a series of questions to our panel and see what answers we get. We'll all learn from this. So what is your experience with families setting up a special needs trust? And maybe Kathy would like to start.
Sure. So here at Plan, we meet with families on a regular basis. You know, we're the nonprofit organization that serves as a professional trustee. And we discuss the different trusts and the options, and our costs are very reasonable because we're a nonprofit organization. For the pool, it's 3% annually, and that covers just about everything, your service coordinator, your checks, all of that stuff. I was wondering though, with Tom or Craig, you talked about families are concerned about the cost of establishing a trust. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yes, well, so a lot of times what happens is when we're having conversations with individuals, families, right? When I say individuals, so families in terms of going through it, a lot of times it's sort of twofold with, going through the process. One, like you just described, Joan, there's multiple trusts, right? What kind of a trust am I setting up and how is that being designated and what's the best avenue, of course, to go with that. But then a lot of times what happens is, and Craig, you can chime in with this as well, that a lot of times dealing with, sitting down and having an attorney draw up the trust arrangement can be several $1,000s, right?
Yeah, and I think that becomes for some people just the reason not to do it because of the immediate cost to set up a trust. And especially, in some cases where people are trying to use remainder assets to fund a trust, they may not have that extra $3,000 or $4,000, available. So yeah, it's just one more hurdle for them to cross to get that done.
Do you want to go into the next one? And the next one?
And are we entertain questions at the end, or we want to do these as they come up?
So let's see what we have here. I have 2 disabled children. Our first lawyer said to set up 2 special needs trusts. New lawyer saying to create 1 trust. Are there any advantages to selecting one model over the other? So
I would say that because of the sole benefit rule, it would be very difficult to manage the trust funds and not impact somebody's benefit and not violate that sole benefit rule. I would be very concerned about that.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. So I think we should talk a little bit about the costs related to a pooled versus a standalone trust.
Right.
You did mention the attorney fees related to that. And I don't know if you want to address that about the costs.
Well,
Yeah, so at Plan, you don't need an attorney to set up your trust. We encourage it because you're signing legal documents, but we don't make that mandatory.
right. And so I was going to ask the question because Kathy had mentioned about that 3% annual fee, but that's on the assets that are in the plan, correct? That's only on assets that have been designated to the trust.
Exactly.
Right, once it's
Right.
funded.
Once it's funded, right? So if the trust is set up but it hasn't been funded, then it's just whatever that initial startup cost is for establishing the trust.
Right. And so for the pool trust, that's $500. For a third-party trust, it's $500. And then once it's funded, then it would be 3%, but the 3% would cover the social work component as well as the investment of the funds. So if it was a standalone, could you address that?
Right. So if you were dealing with this from a traditional, let's call it standalone, traditional third-party trust, you're talking, as Craig said, somewhere in that, probably about $4,000 or $5,000 to establish the trust anyway. And
the other problem becomes managing the trust afterwards, right? Because that becomes who's going to be the trustee. That's the biggest question I get from families is who's going to manage this thing once I set it up. Now there are attorneys that will set up a trust and not manage the funds. There are attorneys that will. And I think, they charge a percentage too. And I'm not exactly positive what it is. It could be anywhere from 1.5 to 3.5%, similar to what you guys do. But I also don't know how,
Right. So,
go ahead.
yeah, I was going to say, our experience has been that attorneys, if they were to be the professional trustee, they would charge their hourly rate, as well as for every transaction, phone call, email, at their hourly rate. And then you would still pay the 1.5 to 1.25 to 1.5% for the investment of those funds.
Right.
So for some people, if they don't have large amounts to put into trust, $1 million, I mean, then this becomes prohibitive to them. So, your trust could be eaten up by fees. So that's, if it's under a certain dollar amount, you really should consider a pool, because then the costs are far less.
Well, I also think the issue too is ongoing management, right? So if you're picking an attorney, a person per se, then you run into the same issue as you would with, having a son or a daughter administer it, is what if they're not there to do that? So then you end up, well, now I'm going to hire a firm to do this. And does a firm specialize in that type of work? So now you don't,
Absolutely.
so it's really about having the consistency there that your pool trust provides. So you guys, I think I said this to one of your advisors before, you're kind of like guidance counselors with a checkbook. You can kind of
True.
So the other experience that we see at Plan all the time is that when families are setting these trusts up, after they're gone, their wishes aren't always carried out, because whoever the executor is or the family member decides, well, no, I'm going to do this, or we decided we're going to do that. And family members are not always savvy about what all the rules and regulations are. So again, disbursements could have a negative impact on benefits.
Yeah, and
And
actually,
they don't want to say no.
That's right. And you want to maintain that healthy relationship between siblings. So if you have one sibling asking another for money and they say no, now you're creating, a strain in that relationship. And
yeah,
that's
as
something
I was going to say is that and we'll come up with it in a couple of when we get into individual assets, because that becomes some of the concern. That right there,
Right.
as you're talking about, that some of that, that oversight of an asset can get into a conversation that may not be one comfortable, or that a trustee is really able to, navigate or figure out their way along with. Yeah, absolutely.
And you do have another question that popped up. I don't know if you want to address it now or later.
Go ahead.
I do. I can read that now. I'd like to set up a special needs trust for my adult learning disabled brother who lives in New York. We live in Massachusetts. Does it matter where or how to set up? So we would recommend that if your brother is living in New York, perhaps you reach out to New York. That way they can work directly with him. We do have people that live in other states, but we do recommend that if the person lives in a different state, that perhaps you reach out to that organization. In this case, it could be NYSARC, and work with them to administer the trust.
So can you have somebody put that into the chat box, that organization, if Natalie is there, or somebody who can just
Yes,
type into the chat
Yeah.
box so that they have
NYSARC,
access.
NYSARC.
it's right here. It's on my cup. NYSARC.
Oh,
Yep.
I think the other piece of that is, again, here at Plan, you get the service coordinators, they're all licensed social workers that work with beneficiaries and their families on a regular basis through the life of the trust. And if somebody didn't live in the state, it's really hard for us to keep eyes on them and make sure that their needs are being met.
Right.
And I think I know the answer to this question, but you have one more that just popped up.
Go ahead.
Do you only manage trusts with investable assets? Do you ever manage one that includes the house the disabled person lives in? So we at Plan do not take real estate. There is a way to set it up where I believe it's a life estate, and we can pay for the upkeep of the house as long as it's for the sole benefit of the person. If it's not, then you'd have to work out an arrangement that would be their portion. But we don't take real estate into our trust. the
Yeah,
next
Fit
question.
on the questions
Yep.
from audience anyway.
As planners, have you come across situations or cases where a family is hesitant or unsure about allocating assets to a special needs trust?
Yeah, and I think that we addressed this a little earlier about, you know, picking out who the trustee should be and maintaining healthy family relationships. And also not putting the burden on a sibling who wants to live their own life and doesn't want the responsibility of having to do the oversight, and protecting benefits is really important.
And allocating the assets, how is it that what's your experience?
Right. Well, so I think that's part of it, right? I don't so much say, hesitant, it's more of, it's daunting, I think is the right word, right? That this whole idea, as we just sort of discussed, this is all about planning and preparation. And so it's becoming, well, what am I going to put in there? Or how am I going to put it in there? Or as Kathy was just alluding to, who's going to manage this once I'm no longer around to try to deal with it? And all of this becomes, almost that like snowball effect of stuck in neutral. I don't know where to go forward or what to do in terms of it. So I think that's the experience has been more of, because everybody's path is different. So where they are along the journey in terms of trying to make some sense of this, and there's an overwhelming a lot of information that you're trying to deal with, like you just talked about. We just went through, there's several different levels of trusts and assets that can be put in there. Forget about dealing with all the other agencies and everything that go along with it. So I think it becomes one of those really needing to sit down and really start to look at what's available or what assets might work or might not work to go into supplemental needs trust.
Well, I also think it's the other hesitancy we see with all families, right? Whether they have a special needs child or not, is when you start moving assets into trust. If it's revocable, that's one thing. If it's irrevocable, well, that means you no longer own the asset. And so when do I want to relinquish that? Like we see some people, the elderly people, when's the best time to place your property into a trust so it doesn't affect, your long-term care situation. So yeah, I think that's always the rule. But I think the bigger thing too with special needs families in particular is that, they're trying to get through today, right? Looking into a week from now or a month from now, let alone 10 or 20 years from now, is very difficult for them. And sometimes they haven't even dealt with their own personal financial situation enough to think, now I got to worry about, what's going to happen with Johnny when I'm not here. So it's really about those, getting through those steps. Now, the first step is, actually make sure you have a trust established. Because if you don't have that, you can't set it up after you're dead. You kind of got to do that while you're alive, just like a will. But it's a good thing to let people know, just take the first steps. You don't have to do everything at once, just do one step at a time.
Right.
Right.
It's almost like building a house. We're going to get a house plan.
Yeah.
Right. And we're going to budget that all out. And then we need to determine what tools we need in order to start the process.
Yeah, absolutely.
So one of the things that we offer here at Plan is a future funded trust. So you can get that trust all set up. And when you're ready, that's when it funds. So, so let's say we've established a special needs trust, and what are some of the things that we would consider doing first?
Right. So the first thing there, and what we would say, and this sort of goes with everybody, right? Is beneficiary reviews, right? So, and this is true for everybody, but we're going to focus here in the supplemental needs world and special needs and dealing with this. So your assets fall into two categories: those that pass by designation, by beneficiary designation, and those that don't, right? So when we talk about beneficiary designation and assets, we're talking about retirement accounts, corporate retirement accounts, 401k, 403b, individual retirement accounts, IRA, life insurance, annuities, and some employer benefits, savings bonds, those type of things. They all pass by who the designated beneficiary is, regardless of what the will or a trust will say. So it's very important to make sure that all of that information is up to date. One, that you know what you have for those assets. A lot of people have multiple retirement accounts. And this is something that Craig and I run into, on a daily basis. I've got an old retirement plan here or there, or two or three of them. well, who are the beneficiaries? And that's what you have to sort of figure out, because the last thing you want to happen is that somewhere along the line, you just named the individual as a beneficiary, or did it in such a way that you could trigger that individual winding up with the asset. So that's the first thing I would say, is that it's making sure that all of the beneficiary information is up to date, and then going through the process, much like Kathy was just describing. Now we're plotting out, how is that going to be designated?
Because you don't want to be inadvertently interrupting benefits for the child.
Right.
Right.
Exactly. So is there a difference? So here at Plan, we take on inherited IRAs, so that we have separate accounts set up for inherited IRAs. Is there a difference between a 401k and a Roth IRA, for example, or a?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Great question, right? So just like the assets, where you've got them into two separate buckets, if you will, like I talked about, that, beneficiary designation versus those that aren't. Your retirement accounts, again, corporate retirement accounts, 401k, 403b, and IRAs fall into two separate categories: pre-tax and after-tax. Pre-tax is those 401k, 403b, and then after-tax is Roth. I'm going to turn it to Craig in a second to go through Roth, but with pre-tax accounts, right? So what you deal with in terms of that with the inherited, there's a couple of considerations there, which the first is that there's a required minimum distribution that has to come out, otherwise known as RMD, right? So that RMD has to come out every year. And that RMD, and I'm assuming that the way the trusts are set up with Plan of Mass is that these are accumulation trusts, right? Because that's one of the things here when you get into design, that versus a conduit, the accumulation, and just for the audience, to just allows the trustee to, instead of distributing the fund, just accumulate it, put it into another account that will allow it to then continue to be held so it doesn't go into the individual's name. So you just want to make sure that the trust design is set up that way. And the other is taxes, right? You're going to pay a higher tax coming out of a trust than you will for an individual. But if the conversation is, I'm going to pay a little bit higher in a tax versus trip up or have this person no longer qualify for benefit, I'm going to pay the higher tax rate. So absolutely, that's how you would set it up. But it's a default thing, right? This is a backup plan, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a second once Craig does the Roth IRA thing with how those distributions are occurring. Go ahead, Craig, in terms of Roth.
Yeah, well, I think you pretty much hit it on the head to begin with. The Roth contribution is after tax. So the nice part about it is, you've already paid the tax on the contribution. You don't have to worry about it on the way out. The other part is that it builds tax free, actually tax deferred, as long as you don't take it out before 59 and a half. And I'm not sure how that rule changes if it becomes a beneficiary designation before the child's 59 and a half. I don't, if you can pull that money out, Tom, without the same benefit or without the same.
But you don't have to. That's part of it is the Roth. There's no required minimum distribution.
Correct. Well, yes, but I'm saying if you pull it out before 59 and a half, there's also no penalty.
Right. Yeah, that I'm not sure.
Well, that's the only thing I'd want to check out for the special needs case, right? But once Tom said, once you move it over, you don't have to take an RMD. There's no 10-year out rule for the beneficiary. It's very, very fluid in that respect. So it gives you a lot more flexibility than the traditional IRA would. Is that what you're trying to hit on in this point?
Yeah, and so I mean the whole thing there is ultimately when you're dealing with the retirement accounts, right? So retirement accounts are set up for retirement benefit. It's a fail-safe. You should definitely have, if you've established, like Joan, you had just mentioned, you've set up the special needs trust. Well, that's where you get into the whole designation thing and want to make sure that the trust is set up in some way as the beneficiary to it, if that's the intent for it, so that it doesn't go there. But ultimately, this is a retirement account. It's meant to fund your retirement, so how much is going to be there?
Those are the other issue too, when you have a third-party trust, you guys can know more about this than I would, that the taxation for gains on a third-party trust can be high. It'd be almost 37%, is that correct?
At the
Correct.
trust level.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Trust
that's
level.
what I was saying. It's taxes. You're going to pay a higher tax rate.
So if it's actually in a Roth, you're not gonna pay that.
Correct.
So that avoids that 37% tax. So that's a huge deal for a third-party trust.
So it looks like we have another question. How does all of this work with SSI? Can the government come after inherited money or non-inherited money that I fund the trust with? So, so that's the reason you set up a third-party trust, is to prevent the person's benefits being impacted. So if you were not to set up a third-party trust, if you had that money go right from your will to the person, they would now, that would be their funds. They would lose their benefits until they came below $2,000 in Massachusetts. And so that's why this proper planning, if you put a third-party trust in, you leave the money to your third-party trust for your child, for the benefit of your child or whoever, then that money is not recognized by the SSI as assets of the child, and they won't be impacted. So that's really, what this whole conversation is about, and how to protect those benefits going forward.
One other consideration you want to have too, especially if you have life insurance policies, is that
Yes.
even though the benefit will go directly to the trust, it's still considered part of the estate for estate tax planning purposes if it's owned by an individual. So if you have a life insurance policy that's going to benefit a trust, you really want the trust to be the owner of that policy so it doesn't become part of the estate of the individual. So because that would just increase the estate taxes on whatever remainder assets were there.
Well, okay.
I don't know if you-
What issues would be putting other investments like stocks into a special needs trust present, and how would you address them with a client?
Right.
So for a pool, you wouldn't do that.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
No. I was just going to say that's, that's part of it is depending on certain assets, just like you talked about, like the home, like certain third-party trusts are not set up to hold them to begin with, right? But if we're looking at this from the idea of, and we're talking about individual stocks here, right? That's what we're talking about. I'll use Bitcoin in there as well, but let's not go down that speculative road here with this. But let's say it's Disney, right? Let's say you've got 200 shares of Disney stock, and that's what you want to leave to a trust. Well, okay, so one, you need a certain type of third-party trust that can hold it, and then you've got to designate what shares you're going to put into that third-party trust. But as we've talked about, that means that at some point the trustee is making the decision on when those shares are going to be sold. And once the proceeds are done, then you have access to them. But they're shares of stock. They need to be addressed. They need to be dealt with. And what would happen if, say, it was a year ago, right? This time a year ago, those shares were down probably 25 or 30% off their value. And the trustee needs to step in and sell. Well, now you've got to sell more shares to make up whatever that dollar amount was. And you're asking a trustee, much like Kathy had talked about before, to now step in and say, well, I'm not sure, maybe I don't do that now because it's a volatile market, everything is down. And so as Kathy was alluding to, saying no, sorry, you can't have any money because I can't sell these shares now because they're lower than they were. So I've got to hold off. And there's a lot involved there where, really the conversation might be more appropriate to say, look, you want to leave 50 or 100 of those shares to the individual. You've set up a pooled third-party trust through the plan of Mass and Rhode Island. Sell the shares now and move the funds over. And then you've designated that money. It's there, it's in the account, and it's done. And you don't have to think about it later on. You don't have to worry about it. You don't have to say that's not an asset that, a non-qualified asset doesn't transfer as a beneficiary designation. You have to decide that. You have to dictate that. And then you also probably might have to deal with probate and other things that go along with it in terms of dealing with that, versus saying, well, okay, I have 200 shares. I want to leave half of that to the individual. I'm going to sell 100 shares. I've set up that third party trust and I'm going to fund it that way.
Wouldn't taxes be also another big consideration? Because if you have those and you're paying capital gains tax versus trust income taxes. That
Well,
could be,
yeah, but you're still in non-qual, it's non-qualified. So you're dealing with capital gains in that situation.
so either way, it doesn't matter. The rate's the same.
Yeah, well, because you're depending on what you're distributing at that point. Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
So I just wanted to go back to the beneficiary reviews, and we were talking a little bit about life insurance as a way to fund a special needs trust.
Yeah.
Here at Plan, we do the future funded, and we recommend that people do a life insurance to fund a future funded trust if that's, the way they want to do it. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, or?
Yeah, absolutely. Because when you're looking at life insurance for a supplemental needs trust, there is no more efficient way to have the money, especially when you're dealing with future funding. But even if you're not dealing with future funding, you're dealing with any trust, there's no way that you can efficiently say, I'm going to have X amount of money, regardless of what happens at the end of my life, that's going to pour over into this trust than through a life insurance contract. Because you're dealing with, we already talked a little bit about taxes. This is a tax-free benefit. This pours over tax-free. There's no taxes that are due in that situation. And you're talking about leveraging, right? $1 buys X amount of coverage. So I know I can take my dollars and guarantee that there's going to be a pool of money set aside for my son or daughter out into the future, regardless of what I do, or going back to retirement accounts and other securities and other assets, regardless of how much I spend of that money. I know that that pool of money is going to be there.
Right. Because the other problem too, and I know you're going to get into a little bit of term versus whole life, but the big issue is, this comes with planning all the time. If I knew exactly when somebody was going to die, all this planning would be really easy, right? You take the amount of money you had, divide it by the years you got left, and you're good to go. The problem though, the big unknown is when. Am I going to die tomorrow? Or am I going to die 50 years from now? And when it's just you, it's one thing. When you're trying to plan for, someone else's life after yours, it's a whole nother ballgame. So you say, well, I'm going to leave, I have retirement assets. I have a house, we've got about, $600,000, $700,000 in net worth. That's all going to go in there. There's no problem. Well, you can't foresee, is there going to be any other major financial issue that's going to come into your life? You're going to have a major medical issue, or you're going to need long-term care, all these other things that can deplete an estate. And now all those best laid intentions just don't happen. So to Tom's point, when you use a life insurance policy and you're directly using that policy to fund the trust, then that number, as long as that premium is paid, that's always going to be there. And it's not attachable by creditors, so you can't run into those types of issues. It's not attachable by long-term care facilities. It's protected. The other thing it allows you to do too is if you've already got that trust funded, you've taken care of that other individual. Now you don't have to worry when you get into retirement that I can't spend my retirement assets because Johnny needs them, right? Now you can live, you can have the retirement you wanted to have, and you can do the things you want to do with your property. You can sell the house and move to Florida. All these things that you can't do if you're worried about preserving those assets to have them go into the remainder trust. So to Tom's point, it is one of the best ways. There is no other way to leverage as much and give as much back in an efficient way as through life insurance. It's just a matter of what type of life insurance you want to use to fund the trust and what kind of leverage you're trying to achieve.
So maybe we should talk a little bit about that, types of life insurance. I know when I've spoken to parents, they want to set up a trust, but they don't feel like they have enough money to set up a trust. And so that's why the life insurance makes the most sense for someone like that. So they care for their child, but they know when they're gone that there's something in place. So, for funding a trust, are there types of life insurance that you would suggest?
Well, so you really, just like every, it seems to be like everything falls into two categories, right? One category versus the other. So in the life insurance world, there are two separate types. You've got term and you have permanent, right? So I'll talk a little bit on term and then I'll turn it over to Craig to do the permanent side. But so, term insurance really is meant as more of protection while you're alive type of thing. So this is usually short-term windows, anywhere from 5 years to 30 years, that a term policy will be in effect. What happens at the end of that time period is that the low cost, which is what it is, tends to skyrocket, right? Because now they know you're at the end of the term and you've been paying the short dollars for a long period of time. So now if you want to stay insured, they're going to raise the rates because they don't want you anymore, essentially is how that works. When we're talking about funding to a trust, something that needs to be there, not really recommending looking at term insurance. No, it's a lesser cost alternative. But what happens in that situation is, the likelihood that the death benefit, which is what this is all about, is going to get paid is very, very low. It's less than 2% of all the death claims that get paid in the life insurance world come from term insurance. They are paid mainly by permanent insurance. And so I'm going to flip it over to Craig to talk about perm. But I mean, really the whole idea with term is it's low cost and for a set period of time. And then after that, it's okay. You got to the end of the road. You're still alive. We're going to, there's no benefit being paid.
Well, that's because of underwriting, right, Tom? Because you can't buy it. If you're 70 years old, you can't buy a 30-year term policy that's going to carry you to 100.
Correct.
Right. So what they're doing is they're selecting people, and they know with utmost confidence based on averages that you have a 97% chance of outliving the term policy. That's why the payout rates are so low. Right. So the issue is, but once again, what Tom said is that if you're going to fund a policy, the important thing about the life insurance, especially whole life, is it's there for your whole life. When's it important to have insurance in force? When you die, right? Because if you don't, it's not in force when you die, then nobody gets anything. So the other thing too is, term insurance is almost like renting versus owning, right? Renting, term insurance is renting the policy. So while you pay the rent, the policy is in force. But once you end the policy, in most cases, there's no cash value, right? So sometimes it can wind up being more expensive. Whole life insurance is, like I said, the premiums are higher initially, but it does a couple of things that the term doesn't do. One, it builds cash value. Just like you buy a home, it builds equity. So it builds cash value inside the policy. So after so many years, this policy could actually, because most whole life policies pay dividends, could actually end up paying for itself. So once again, that's a solution that can be baked in depending on when you decide to take it out. The other thing is, as long as the premiums are paid, it's 100% guaranteed it's going to pay out when you die. That's the important thing. It's going to pay out when you die. So while it may seem a little bit more expensive up front, it's really important to make sure that whatever you do in funding this policy is permanent in some way. Now, I also think that sometimes, like you said, some people, lower income, they can't afford it. The premium may be overwhelming. Sometimes you can do what you call, buy a term policy and make sure the term is convertible to a permanent policy down the road. So maybe if your financial situation gets a little bit better, you can turn the term in almost like renting to own, right? So you can actually, take that term insurance and turn it into a whole life policy. So
I think you've actually just got that as a comment. I thought I saw it pop up in the chat window there.
Oh, okay.
There is a question. Yeah.
That was unprompted.
Yeah.
Yeah, the issue, once again, right. So the nice part about taking out insurance when you're younger is you're never younger or healthier than you're going to be today. So if you can, like you said, put some of those things and convert it later, you're kind of preserving your insurability, which is nice. The only thing you got to remember though is to convert, because the problem is when your conversion is going to be based on the age at which you convert. So if you take out a policy and you're 25 years old, the term policy may be very, very inexpensive, but if you wait to convert till you're 50 or 55, now it's going to be a lot more expensive to get started, and the cash value is not going to be as great. So it's just a matter of, a placeholder. But once again, you got to consider doing the best that you can with what you have. You said if you're, don't have a lot of money, and you can buy a term policy for $40 a month that gives you 250,000 or 300,000 in coverage. Well, that's a Band-Aid, and it gets you through, if something happened to you in the future years. But once again, that Band-Aid is going to run out, and you need to have something permanent in place at some point. So you just want to make sure you're preparing for that.
Right, and part of that is with that conversation, much like I think it was Mary who chimed in with the chat there in terms of that strategy, right? A lot of times those conversion privileges become limited, right? So they may not be there for a long period of time. A lot of policies have a limited time frame on their conversion privilege. So you just want to make sure a lot of this, it all comes back to, just like we talked about from the beginning, planning and preparation. What are the steps involved? What am I trying to do? What am I trying to accomplish? And it might be a situation that, I've put a large policy in place for now that's term that I'm going to convert, but not all of it. As Mary was describing in the chat box, there are pieces of it as I go along that would then end up being that permanent that's going to the special needs trust ultimately over time. And that's why we're talking about the leveraging fact there, that you can't do that. There's no way to do that with your retirement account. There's no way to do that with any other asset where you're saying, this is how I'm setting it up and I'm dictating this, that I'm doing that out over time.
The other thing to consider too is, unlike your retirement account, if you became disabled, a lot of policies have what we call waiver of disability. So in other words, you would actually pay for the policy if you became disabled. So once again, if you became disabled, you'd be concerned about your own financial picture, but how do you now continue to, put away money or pay the premium to support the trust? So it's another protection mechanism, like Tom just said, that's not going to happen with your retirement account or other assets. No one's going to just step in and make the payments for you. So just one other thing to consider.
Can you recap for us what, if a family hasn't a special needs trust established, what should they be doing to that toolbox that we talked about?
Right. So like we said from the get-go, really, this is all about preparation, planning, and process, much like Kathy described, right? I love the analogy there of building the house. So you're sort of looking at the blueprint, right? So the step back is, all right, I'm putting together that plan. How do I want this to go? And the first thing is asset gathering, right? So that idea of, all the stuff that you have, where is it all? And then that's where we get into the conversation about looking at those beneficiary reviews or ownership. Who owns what assets? How is the deed set up if there's property? All of those considerations that sort of start it. And then you got to get into, all right, not only am I trying to plan for this individual's the rest of their life, but as Craig said, you've got to have your plan going alongside, as this goes. It's sort of a parallel course here, because it's one thing to say, I'm going to leave assets into a trust. It's another to actually have those, like, you guys probably experienced with those future funded trusts that, okay, it's all well and good to say I'm going to leave my retirement account in there. But if I live and as Craig mentioned, and use my retirement assets, there's nothing left
right
to then be able to put in there. And so that's where the conversation comes in, that it might make sense to have some kind of, an amount of a life insurance policy that at least from the at minimum funding levels, is going to be there, that there's going to be something that's going to flow into that trust regardless of what happens.
And I think the other thing too to take into consideration, even just the conversation we're having today, maybe making some people dizzy, right? So your understanding is there's a lot of factors involved, depending on ages and what assets and what state you're involved in, and just what you're trying to accomplish with children. Seek out professional help with this one. Don't be a do-it-yourselfer, because if you get this wrong, you can't go back and do a redo, especially if you passed away. The other thing too, and we talk about all the time, Tom and I, is unintentional gifting from other family members that can throw your whole plan off the rails. So it's really important, like I said, in this case, to seek out professionals that can help you do this the right way. And sometimes you got to find the professional that fits best with you as well. I know there was one participant who was saying, I'm getting two different types of advice from two different attorneys, right? Well, it's good to have, a financial advisor, your trust manager like you guys, an attorney. You should have several professionals all helping to guide you in the same path. And if they can work together, even better, right? I mean, your attorney should be reaching out to your accountant, you should be reaching out to your trust manager. So you're all on the same page with what's going on with this stuff. And so you don't have to be this person trying to be, you know, you're a quarterback, but you don't need to know every play. You don't need every position and how it works. You just need to know what the end result needs to be, which is to get that touchdown. So get the right players in place so you can achieve your goal.
That's one of the things that we do here. We realize this is a major commitment for people. And so we don't charge for telephone calls. We welcome calls. You can call at any time and ask any question. Because we have licensed social workers, we understand the rules related to Social Security, Medicaid, housing. And so we answer those questions, and we realize that you're probably going to call back. We recommend that people work with an attorney. You're not required to have an attorney to join the trust, but we do highly recommend that you do that to get your questions answered, and work with your investment advisor to figure out what's the best thing for you, your disabled loved one, and the rest of your family. So there's so many things at play that, but we understand. So, call us if you need to speak with us. If we can't answer the question, then we'll, forward you to someone else, or we'll get the answer.
Right. And that's the most important thing. I think like both of you just stressed, and for the audience there, it's really that professional team setup structure as far as going through that, because that's what I would say is part of that preparation process, is making sure that those pieces are there, because it can be overwhelming. I used the word daunting earlier, right? That is, the biggest thing that we get with this is that there's just so much information and so much detail. And, as Craig said, everything we've gone through today just, starts to get a little bit, glassy eyed in terms of dealing with everything. But that's ultimately the idea, is to have that team of professionals available who you can bounce questions off, just like you said, be able to pick up the phone or shoot an email and ask a question, which is tremendous, because, you never know when it's going to come up or when it's going to happen, but there's going to be questions.
Well, it's also no cookie cutter answer for anybody. Everybody's situation,
That's right.
especially the special needs situation, is different. Your child's capacity, the care they're going to need, your financial situation, those family members around them that can provide support or not provide support. So you really need to get into the weeds with your own particular situation. And I will say that anybody who has set up a trust, especially with you guys, that is a fantastic first step, but it's only the first step. If you haven't sat down and done, got the funding picture together, then you really, you've only got the first base. You really haven't done the plan. How many times, Tom, have we seen people, I've got a trust, but there's nothing funded in it. Well, what you have is a piece of paper that with nothing to go with it. So, you guys are there to help people, manage their trust, but you can't manage something that's not existing, right? $500 to set up your trust, it's all set up, but nothing goes into it. What good did it do, right? So,
Right.
so
That's
really
correct.
follow through would be the other thing. Follow through. It's just too important to leave open.
And it's, as you said, it's a daunting task, but you can't move forward if you don't start. So if our participants want to reach out to you with additional questions, is there a way they could do that? Or are you welcoming their calls? Or
Yeah, absolutely. We can, I'm going to see if I can do this. This is asking me to be technology here in terms of dealing. I'll throw in my email and phone number into the chat box.
And the same thing too, like Tom and I, we don't charge for questions. We actually do a full financial profile for somebody at no charge. It's all part of us just trying to help people who are helping other people, giving back and making sure people are on the right course. Because we know that if there's other things, like if you want to put the life insurance in place, or you want to do some retirement, planning, we can help you with that as well. So we just want to help people get on the right path. And we're happy to, if we get into a situation we don't know an answer, we will find the right person who does. It's all about making connections and getting you to the right resources.
it's great. Yeah. So we actually put our contact information in as well. So, if you have any questions, or you just want to even just check out the website and see what's there, there is an application online. You could even look at it and decide what you want to do. But again, don't hesitate to call. Kathy can answer any questions. So yeah. Yeah. So anything to do with benefits, even if you just want to ask about benefits,
Mhm.
you know, so yeah, feel free.
So any questions from the audience? Anything lingering out there?
I don't see anything in the chat box right now.
Nothing so far, or nothing more.
Okay.
So we glassed everybody over. That's what we did.
Yeah.
Well, we answered all their questions. We did such a good job, right?
All right. On that note, I'm going to stop the recording